when I was very young, the only music that was in the household was what my parents had. And this is a common story. You know, suddenly my older brother brings home this song called Heartbreak Hotel. The figure that Elvis struck and the sense of young people having their own music was such a cultural shock that it was you know, it was very profound. I began religiously listening to all of the 45s that my older brother brought home, and I got first a ukulele and then later a small 3/4 size guitar when I was maybe 8, and taught myself songs. I got a chord book, and it wasn't about really thinking of the guitar as a solo instrument. It was about learning all these great songs that I loved and singing them. And I came from an upper middle class household where there were certain expectations. I was an athlete, I was a swimmer, as were my two brothers. And I think there was a point in time where probably my mom and dad were saying, you know, something's wrong with Lindsey. And, but I kind of lived the life of what was expected of me, which was, it was beautiful. I had a wonderful upbringing, communal, supportive, and they did, my parents did nurture the idea of me playing guitar. They did not nurture the idea of me going into the business with good reason, I think, you know. And so that pretty much was my life through high school. I kept the guitar to myself. I learned it and improved on it on my own terms, in my own way, without lessons. And I didn't really get into a band until after I graduated from high school. And what happened then was the first year of college, I went out for water polo in the fall, but I had started to deprogram over the summer, you see. So my hair had started to grow, and I had joined this band, and suddenly all of the things that I had been programmed to be seemed to fall away. We started a band. Stevie was in that band because she was at the same college. I you know, met Stevie when I was in high school, and so that's pretty much how I got started. The band that I was in college was a lot of fun. I wasn't seeing Stevie then, but what happened was that band broke up, and somehow some external energy came to us. They met us more than halfway. People from LA, we'd come to LA to look for a deal and had not found one, but people became interested in Stevie and myself as a duo. And so, of course, a light bulb went off, and that defined, to some degree, our self-image. And that was also the moment in which we became romantically involved. And we suddenly had this vision or this dream of somehow coming up with material and singing two-part harmonies and infusing that with a certain style of guitar playing. So we found a kind of a style we could call our own, a body of songs that we could shop. And we had made a good connection with a guy named Keith Olson, who was an engineer and producer down here. And eventually we realized that we had to come down to LA in order to be where the situation was for something to happen. So we decided to get in the car and basically move to LA, at least for a while. And we stayed at Keith Olson's house. And, you know, it didn't take long. About 3 months later, we actually got a record deal. Yeah, we put out an album on Polydor, and it was called Buckingham Nicks. We were very proud of it. I'm still very proud of it. You know, I think it holds up very well. It has kind of become a cult album. And at the time, it did not really catch on. And of course, we were dealing with the disappointment, but also the confusion and the question where to go from there, how not to get swallowed up in some sort of series of expedient moves, how to remember who we were. We were also in the process of writing new material and in the process of trying to make a second Buckingham Nicks album. And it was at that moment that we met Mick Fleetwood. Mick had heard my guitar playing, and he actually called and asked me to join because he knew Bob Welch was going to leave. He wasn't thinking about another woman in the band. Christine McVie was already in the band. And I said, well, if you take me, you got to take my girlfriend. And he said, I'll get back to you on that one. So I guess he went and discussed it with Christine and John and came back and said, yeah, cool. So that was it. That was the beginning of Fleetwood Mac. For a band that started off really as a 12-bar blues band and then, progressed into a really experimental blues-based band with Peter Green until he left. I mean, and then went through so many different style changes. I mean, I've often said I give Mo Ossin so much credit. And it's really a comment on what the business was and what it is now, that he allowed them to stay on the label through all those different incarnations when they were really not making the label any money to speak of. Mo had the autonomy and the smarts to say, well, there's something maybe afoot here. I think we need to just allow them the ferment to keep going and see what happens. And what happened eventually was they found Stevie and me. And that kind of spontaneity doesn't exist in that way in the business today in terms of the relationship between an artist and a label, because everything has become slightly, or more than slightly, bottom line oriented and boardroom kind of mentality. And it's not the people. Everyone's trying to do the best job they can, but I think systematically no one has the kind of autonomy that someone like Mo Ostin had. Christine and John McVie were married when we joined. Stevie and I were a couple. And the writing was all about what was going on behind the scenes. So, the first album, it wasn't really worn on its sleeve so much because we were all still couples. But of course, nothing like joining a band and having some success to have things kind of blow up. So, of course, within the first year, John and Christine had separated, and Stevie and I were still together, but were on the road to not being, so that by the time we got up to Sausalito to start recording the Rumours album, Stevie and I were not really a couple anymore. And so, and yet we had this calling that we had to fulfill. We had extraordinary success on the first album, the Fleetwood Mac album, and we didn't have the time to not be together, to get closure. So it was this huge exercise in denial, in compartmentalizing your feelings, leaving all your feelings over here in this corner of the room and getting on with what you had to do in the rest of the room. It wasn't the healthiest thing in the world, but it made for some fascinating music. And I firmly believe that there was a point in time, because Rumours was a hugely successful album. And I believe that it wasn't all about the music. Much of it, there was a point where the success of the album detached from the music itself and became about the success, and became about people investing in us as couples, as spurned couples, investing in our personal lives. Again, bringing out the voyeur in people, bringing out the that soap opera aspect that the band had at that time. It was very difficult for me as a guy to go in and produce that record, to do the right thing for Stevie on a daily basis. It was a hurtful thing, but that's rock and roll. See, the record company has this axiom, which is run it into the ground and move on. Meaning, find the brand, find the formula that makes the brand, and repeat it until it's used up. Well, that's a fine notion from a business point of view. It isn't necessarily a good notion from an artistic point of view. So rather than go out and try to repeat the formula that was Rumours, I got the band all engaged in a different process, some of which was me working at home on some experimental things and bringing them in half done and, sort of painting half a painting and then bringing it in and having everybody else complete it. Everyone got very engaged in that process. That album ended up being the Tusk album. That was a line in the sand that I drew for myself because, again, people want to brand you as one thing when you've had that kind of success. They want to see you repeat it. You slowly find yourself being painted into a corner, and you slowly, potentially anyway, begin to forget what it is you care about, who you are, why you're doing what you're doing. And I didn't want to find myself in that position. Now, what happened with Tusk, which is probably my favorite album just because it represents a far more left side of the palette, which is where I live musically. What happened with that album is that, as I said, the band was quite entranced with the process. They weren't so entranced with the commercial outcome. Relative, I mean, it sold maybe 4 or 5 million albums, but relative to Rumours, there was a kind of an edict that came down from the rest of the band that we weren't going to do that kind of thing anymore, and that we were going to kind of backtrack into something a little more mainstream. So, and I don't begrudge anyone from the band having that feeling. There's two ways to look at it. From a lot of people's point of view, I was being a troublemaker, including the record company. Let's just say if that album had come out and had the same outcome commercially and the band had still wanted to go down that road, probably I never would have started making solo albums, because that was a process which was very much in line with the way I do make solo albums. It was just when someone said, well, we're not going that far to the left again, that I needed an outlet for it. And so because of that, and again, one of the reasons that Tusk is my favorite album is because it does represent a way of thinking, that a choice that I made to try to define myself as someone who wanted to keep growing, keep taking risks. It was not a popular move at the time to define myself as that. But that did create this sense of the large machine of Fleetwood Mac, which truly did enable the small machine, but it gave me the small machine as well. And that's something I've come to value, the tension between those two and how they help each other. What I bring from solo projects back to Fleetwood Mac and how I wouldn't have the solo projects without Fleetwood Mac. My orchestral style of playing was more at the forefront, I think, as far back as the Buckingham Nicks album. And then, of course, during the process of adapting to being in an ensemble, which was Fleetwood Mac, some of that got pared back. It's one of those things that has evolved and it sort of reared its head again and pushed its way out of the idea of production and into just a simple form of playing with a voice, which is, it's not a novel idea, but, taking it to a certain level of style, it covers a lot of ground. And so that's something that I've gotten more and more interested in and been able to do more and more successfully. I kind of think of myself more as a stylist than a writer, and the writing has actually gotten better, I think, if you look at the lyrics on this new album, Seeds We Sow. I mean, what's happened is they've become more, I don't want to say poetic, but more kind of open to interpretation, kind of a Rorschach for whoever is looking at them. It can become any number of things, and I take that as growth because it's not a literal "baby you left me" kind of thing. I mean, there are any number of ways to look at a set of lyrics, and quite honestly, I may not know what I'm talking about either. You sort of are throwing lyrics together until something finally arrives, and it's coming from the subconscious. It's almost like a beat thing, and then you may look at it and go, "Oh, I know what that means." And to me, that's exciting and that's growth. But I will say that the process of working with a band is different from working on solo work most of the time. Because obviously, if you're going to be working with a group of people, you've got to bring something in which is fully enough formed for them to get a handle on it and to take it to where it's going to go. And I always liken that to possibly shooting a scene in a movie, because you have to have a script most of the time, and you have to have certain specifics going in, and then how you get from point A to point B, I think tends to be a more conscious process, more verbalized, possibly even more political. Now, when I'm working alone, I always think of it more like painting. Like on the new album, I mean, I played almost everything myself. I engineered it. I was down here pretty much by myself most of the time. And it's very much how I see a painter coming down and working on a canvas. It's way more meditative. It's not so conscious. It's not political at all. And you're kind of allowing the work to become something and to lead you. You're, in a way, even though you're responsible for what's going on, you're taking a more passive role, if that makes sense, and the work becomes something that you have a one-on-one with, and it begins to define itself to you in terms of what it wants to be. And there has to be a certain quiet and a certain kind of meditative aspect that I liken to the painting process, and so there is a difference. When you have new material, it's all about the process of bringing it to fruition live. You know, that's the real challenge. I have no apprehension about putting something new in front of an audience. It's really more the challenge of how do we get this done on stage, and that can be like trying to solve a math equation, really, because you have to break it down and look at the pieces and who does this and who does that, and does it need any augmenting, and there's all of that. But it's fun. It's so much fun. These are problems that I don't get to work on in Fleetwood Mac so much, because that process does not come into play in the same way. You can enjoy something that might be 30 years old and have it stand side by side with something that's brand new. And if you're doing it all properly, it's all going to hang together. This show that we have put together is it represents a body of work, but it represents many things. The show opens with 5 acoustic songs in a row. And then, you're going into a couple of fairly obscure pieces that then set up a couple of new songs. And then you're doing a couple of things that people are expecting to hear, Secondhand News and Tusk. And then you're doing 3 more new songs. So by the time you get to some of these things, you feel like they have a different relationship with the whole than they've ever had before. And that's what keeps them fresh. We came off the road with Fleetwood Mac. I was really enjoying myself. There was a chance that we might have gone on and done some more dates, and I was completely open to that. It ended up, for various reasons, not happening. Fleetwood Mac is a complicated animal, and it's very seldom that you get everyone to want the same thing. But the time did open up just out of the blue, and it seemed that there was going to be a year plus to do something, and so I thought, well, okay, I'll make an album. I really was not planning on making an album. There was not some big calling to do it, and maybe that's part of what's good about it, is that there was a certain offhandedness, a certain sense of doing it, not as a lark by any means, but just, as not a weighty decision, and without any particular agenda. And I think a lot of things rose up out of that surprised even me. I had no expectations as to what kind of an album it would be. It just sort of went where it went. And when we got done, I thought, or when I got done, I was quite surprised because, I'm just happy, very happy with it, It's always difficult naming an album, but I had written this song, Seeds We Sow, and when I started to look at the subject matter, I was looking for the thread that ran through the songs, and there was no obvious thread. There are songs that are comments on the world in general. There are songs that are about relationships, about much smaller situations. But when I thought about it, I thought that the thread, again, as I had said before, was that, actions that we take have consequences, and that when you look at the state of the world as it is now, it's not there's nothing large, everything is small. It's all this amalgamation of small events that add up to something. So you could look at it as the collective of the choices people make. And the choices that I make in a given day have an effect on people that are around me. When you extend that out over, billions of people, it adds up to something, an extremely strong force, So I thought it just felt like the individual things that are talked about in the songs were all, about things karmic, things that, whatever you do now is going to have an effect on you and others later. And it just seemed like an appropriate title. Illumination was a piece that started off as, oddly enough, something for a TV show. And it was not even a whole song. They wanted like a 30-second piece. And so I gave them the intro and a verse and a chorus and then another little arpeggio. And that was the whole thing. And they didn't like it. I think it scared them a little bit. And so it sat around for a while, and then when I happened on it again, like halfway through working on this album, I thought, that's pretty cool. Maybe I ought to make that a whole song. And that's what I did. The drums on there are actually from GarageBand, and just had a lot of fun finding little fills and stuff in there. And it's a very simple song, but it did start off as a very short piece and then got kind of expanded from there. And what it's about, um, you know, everything on the album is on some level about, you know, the consequences that actions have, and you know, I probably that song is a kind of a tongue-in-cheek, cynical look at you know, looking at whether someone's being honest or not. It's got a little bit of a sense of the interrogator in there, you know. Tell me something you've never told anyone before, you know. But perhaps looking around, wondering, you know, if trust you have is well founded, you know. A little bit of paranoia thrown in there. There's another song called End of Time. That was actually another choice for an album title, but it seemed a little down. So I moved away from that. But it really is, I don't think it's necessarily talking about the end of time in the sense of dying or in the sense of the end of the world. It's just about the end of an era or the end of a certain way of thinking, the end of a spell that someone may have been under, and what happens after that. Stars Are Crazy. That's an interesting piece because it took on a slightly different aspect live than the recording, and I like both of them equally well. That's also a song that was co-written. Someone I met only very briefly up in San Jose, and who gave me her album, a CD she'd had, and this was probably, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. A woman named Lisa Dewey, and it sat in I remember sort of having the CD, and it sat in my closet for a while, and you know, I always like to listen to things that people give me, because, you know, every once in a while something you'll find something that hits, and if you can expound on it and make it something else that's your own, and also raise the level of what they've, you know, brought, you know, it's just a really a nice thing to happen. And so you know, I took aspects of what she had done and of course added my own thing. And I don't think she's heard it yet. I hope she likes it. That's the Way Love Goes is kind of wild. It's you know, it's one of those things that you really don't see it coming. It starts off with reminiscent of the song "Come" from the Say You Will album, the Fleetwood Mac album, where it starts off in a very kind of nice light music box way, and then all of a sudden the chorus slams in with full rock, you know, kind of tonality. And that was a song that we cut with my band here. So that's got Walfredo Reyes playing drums, and you know, Neil Haywood playing bass, and we set up in here and we cut it. We were rocking, and that's a fun one on stage too. I can't sing it very well, but you know, it's some of these things I recorded them, and you know, geez, we had to lower the keys of these things so I could do them on stage, but that's okay. In Our Own Time, that's one of my favorite songs on the album. It's probably a little bit harder to get a handle on right away. That's probably why I like it. I feel like that song, the way it's constructed, the use of certain familiar things in terms of guitar style, but then the use of unfamiliar things, it feels like I found something like a new vocabulary musically in that song, more than on any other song possibly on the record, in terms of dealing with ensemble and single guitar living together, you know, in somewhat of an uncharted territory. And and so musically, I really am happy with that song. I think that song was about my relationship with my wife, Kristen, you know. There are several songs about her, you know. And again, it's about people trying their best to find each other and quite often missing, and the illusions that get created or the distrust that can get created when that happens. But, you know, at this point in my life, there's a freedom in knowing that I would never want anything else but what I have as far as a personal life. And that, you know, there's a faith that whatever drifts or swings from right to left, you know, it'll always come back. And sometimes being in a long-term relationship, being in a family is about having the faith to wait.